Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so this sounds better. Hello, everybody. I welcome you to the first post-lunch session on volume rendering and rendering. My name is Christoph Gard. I'm from the University of Kaiserslautern. It's my pleasure to be your session chair. We have 6 exciting talks on this topic. The first talk is on, oops, sorry about that. The first talk is on 4-volnet fast volume rendering using foveated deep neural networks. The talk is given by David Bauer, but before we begin, I want to highlight that this paper was actually selected for an honorable mention award, so I think that deserves some round of applause before the talk begins.
All right, good afternoon. My name is David Bauer. I'm a PhD student at VD Labs at UC Davis with my advisor, Quan Liu. And today we present 4-volnet, fast volume rendering using foveated deep neural networks. And in this work, we introduce a method to considerably increase the performance of volume visualization using foveated rendering and deep learning. With our method, we're able to convincingly reproduce ray-marched images with global illumination effects like dynamic volumetric shadows, and we achieve multiple times the performance of our baseline renderer with little to no sacrifices in image quality. Before we describe the technique itself, let us first look at what motivates this work. Most of today's scientific visualization involves some form of volume rendering, and there's a vast array of data sources in science, and the pace at which capturing technologies evolve in these areas is ever growing. When it comes to rendering scientific data, visual fidelity dictates performance. Expensive shading techniques are often required for researchers to effectively analyze the data and gain insights. Current shaded rendering techniques that produce accurate global illumination effects are usually not fast enough to render large volumes in real time on consumer hardware. So that means we need to start making trade-offs. So either we need more or better hardware, think about GPU clusters or cloud rendering, or we give up on the high frame rates. But we were asking ourselves, is there a way to preserve visual fidelity while keeping adequate performance for real-time rendering? And before we see how we address this question, we need to cover some background. So first, I want us to think about our visual system. It's been well studied that only a small part, in fact, only about 5 degrees of our total visual field is able to resolve high levels of detail. And we call this part of the field the fovea. And the peripheral areas of our vision are generally much worse at resolving such high levels of detail. And to illustrate this, we showed us what this roughly means on the right here. So going from the center of vision, we can read text between 5 to 10 degrees. From the fovea, shapes are discernible between 5 and 30 degrees. And any farther than that, we commonly only see differences in color. And these facts are the basis for a rendering technique that has been coined as foveated rendering in recent years. The idea behind foveated rendering is to create images that can be produced in a shorter amount of time while preserving the perceptual quality of a fully rendered image. And this is done by preserving high levels of detail around the user's focus while gradually decreasing the quality towards the periphery. And post-processing, like upsampling or blurring, is then usually used to reconstruct the full image. And this approach is really at the core of our project here. Let's now look at the method itself. The general idea behind 4-volnet is quite simple. First, we sparsely render a volume using foveated rendering, which saves us a significant amount of time when we sample the volume. And second, we pass the sparse rendering through a deep learning algorithm that reconstructs the full frame. And the premise here is that if we can perform this inference step on the right faster than the time it takes to complete the full frame, we effectively outperform the traditional rendering method. Let's now look at some of the details of the 2 steps, and I want to start with foveated rendering. So to create sparse images from volume data, we synthesize a sampling map that models our eye's visual acuity, prioritizing the area around the fovea, and using this map, we create a binary sampling mask for our renderer. So our sampling masks are based on a blue noise pattern, which we use to determine if a pixel should be sampled or not based on a threshold value, and we call this threshold value tau. The value for tau is individually determined per pixel and is based on the sampling PDF that we saw in the previous slide and this blue noise pattern. To determine if a pixel should be sampled or not, we compare the value tau against the noise value at that pixel, and if the noise value is less than tau, the sample will be taken, otherwise the pixel stays blank, and that results in this binary map that we see on the right here. Next, let's see how deep learning helps us reconstruct the full frame. So to achieve high quality and appropriate speed for the deep learning step, we design a new type of hybrid neural network. And it's a two-stage recurrent network that is based on the WNet architecture. And for those unfamiliar with the terms, the WNet architecture is basically a neural network architecture that's got its name from the fact that it contains two UNet architectures in sequence. So in our design, we pass the sparsely rendered image through these two stages, with each UNet fulfilling a specific purpose. The first stage is a direct prediction stage, trained to in-paint or reconstruct the missing pixels in the input image. And the second stage is a kernel prediction network that refines the output of the first stage using predicted pixel-wise convolutions. And we derive the data for these convolutions from the hidden state of the first network. So that first network really serves two discrete purposes. And after applying the pixels, the pixel filters, we end up with the final output image here on the right. And now I want to look at some of the results that we get from these two steps. To evaluate our technique, we record both quality and speed of rendering, and we compare these metrics to the ground truth ray-marched images and the state-of-the-art method Deep Fovea, which is a method recently introduced for foveated video compression. And overall, the results show that our method greatly improves rendering performance and generalizes well to even unseen data sets, all the while preserving the visual quality of the image and providing better quality than prior techniques. So let's look at image quality in more detail. And before I want to show specific data, I'll show a short clip of what that whole process looks like. So we'll see a short video sequence showing first the sparsely rendered frames as produced by the renderer, with the fovea moving around, and the final output of our reconstruction method. And we'll see this on a bunch of data sets. Here's another example. This is the output of the rendering step, sparsely rendered, and this is the final result after we pass it through the neural network reconstruction. And there's one more, sparse rendering, and you can see the fovea moving across the screens to simulate the user's eyes movements, shift in focus, and this is the reconstruction. So now that we've seen a video, let's look at the visual quality of a still frame, and I'm showing an example here from one of our data sets. We used the chameleon data set to evaluate it, and we show two excerpts here. One is from the foveated area in blue and the peripheral area in yellow. And you can see that the quality of FoveNet is quite close to the ground truth. And when compared to deep fovea, it's able to just preserve these fine-grained detail that we don't really get in prior methods. Both the foveated and peripheral areas of the frame are similar in reconstruction quality, as you can see here, and there's much more metrics in our paper. And now I want to look at rendering performance, the core contribution here. So by how much can we improve rendering performance compared to the baseline method? And we saw this clip briefly in the beginning. I just want to show this again here. We're able to achieve very good performance boosts in our tests. And obviously, the exact numbers depend on the angle and the viewport, but we usually see numbers between 2 to 4 times speed up in average cases. But to be more precise, aside from having this example, we also conducted a performance analysis on all of our data sets, recording frame times over a standardized 500 frame long sequence. And these sequences were engineered to account for various camera angles, so we get a good average in performance. And we record data for 2 quality settings. One is optimized for speed, and the other one is optimized for quality. And those 2 settings basically just vary in the density of our samples. So here are the results for the high quality setting and the high speed setting. And overall, we found that on average, we're able to double or even triple the rendering performance for high quality and high speed settings respectively. And obviously, those are averages. Some of our benchmarks went up to 5 or even 6 times speed up when the volume was placed just right. And with this, I want to move to the last section of the talk and mention that obviously there are some limitations to our approach, but these really also point us towards possible future work. So one limitation we observed during our tests was that the network was unable to gracefully handle high-frequency content in the volume, and these were not well compensated by the recurrent connections in the network, which usually are responsible for reusing prior data from previous frames. And most such cases are limited to scenarios where the sampling rate of the ray marcher was too low, which then resulted in banding artifacts. And usually ray jittering is commonly used to mitigate such artifacts. However, we did not design our training data to account for this additional statistical variation in the input data, but future iterations of the work could account for this additional approach. And aside from addressing limitations, we also consider some future direction for this approach. So first, we look beyond ray marching and explore ways to use this approach for path-traced volume, where there's additional noise in the data. And finally, we want to explore ways to further optimize this pipeline with the goal in mind to take this approach to immersive space and enable exploration of volume data in virtual reality. And this brings us to the end of our talk. In conclusion, we can say that FOVONet significantly improves volume rendering performance with little to no sacrifices in image quality, not even in the periphery. And this really makes it interesting for a broader area of application where foveation might not be an option. And aside from being a valuable technique to improve performance overall, it's also an important step towards high-fidelity volume visualization in immersive space. And with that, I want to thank you very much for attending, and I'm now opening the Q&A.
All right, thank you very much. We have time for a short question. Please raise your hand. Okay.
I have thank you. It's a good talk. Very nice research. But I'm wondering about one thing. You said that it generalizes to some degree to even the volumes that it didn't see. How much of a degree? What does that mean? Can you put in like completely different volume and you will get something meaningful, or is it just blob?
So it is actually very meaningful. You might just see a slight decline in image quality when you look at compared to the ground truth data. This is really just about the variety we have in our training data set. We could definitely create a larger set of training samples that account for more visual differences in the images, but ultimately it's an image space technique, so we don't really model to a specific type of volume. So as long as the image looks like a volume rendering, this method will be able to reconstruct it.
All right, if there are no more questions, in the interest of time, let's move on. Let's thank the speaker again. The next presentation is about G-ray, ray casting for visualization and interactive data exploration of Gaussian mixture models. The presentation will be given by Kyla Von via video, and this is also an honorable mention for the Best Paper Award, so let's give this a round of applause.
Hello everyone, my name is Kyla Von, and today I would like to show you a way to visualize and explore high-dimensional Gaussian mixture models. Before doing so, I would like to mention that Carl Pearson is considered the inventor of Gaussian mixture models. His work was mainly motivated by the understanding of Darwin's theory of evolution. A colleague and friend of his, Francis Galton, who was also a cousin of Darwin himself, observed that the distribution of human height could be described by a Gaussian normal distribution. Based on this, he expected some children of tall parents to be even taller, and some children of small parents to be even smaller. Instead, he observed a regression to the mean. That is, the offspring of tall parents tend to be smaller, while the offspring of small parents tend to be taller than their parents. As a result, the entire distribution remained stable and does not evolve into subspecies of tall and short, respectively, as Galton expected. Pearson assumed that only evolutionary pressure can force a deviation from a normal distribution. So he looked for such deviations in empirical data. He came across such data in the form of the ratio of forehead breadth to body length, measured in crabs sampled in Naples, Italy. Plotting the empirical distribution of these ratios show that it is unimodal, like a normal distribution, but skewed, in contrast to a normal distribution. Pearson conjectured that the distribution is actually a mixture of two Gaussians. In an admirable effort that includes inventing the method of moments, he fitted such a mixture to the empirical distribution and obtained an almost perfect fit. From that, he concluded that the crab's population at Naples actually comprises two subspecies. In general, a Gaussian mixture model describes the distribution of a mixture of random variables from several different populations. Thus, it is a weighted sum on Gaussians. These Gaussian mixture models have widespread applications in probability theory, statistics, and machine and deep learning. I guess we already have an idea of a Gaussian and what it looks like. Mu indicates the mean and sigma indicates the variance. The smaller this value is, the larger the Gaussian is. For multidimensional Gaussians, it looks similar, but the sigma is now a positive definite matrix. To visualize this Gaussian, software packages usually replace x with x1 multiplied with a canonical basis vector, here e1, and added to x2 multiplied with e2 and added to mu. In this case, the Gaussian simplifies to this equation. The inverse of sigma is now just a 2 times 2 matrix, resulting from the top left part of the matrix sigma. But with various combination of the canonical bases, we can just extract the individual part. Finally, we extract the eigenvector and eigenvalues of the remaining 2 times 2 matrix to illustrate the ellipse, which represents the Gaussian. This works easily because we only used combinations of the canonical bases. Then you see these kind of typical illustrations. You see data points and mostly the isolines of the individual Gaussians. But again, this is performed just on the canonical basis vectors, which you can see here on the left. But what we wanted to do is, we want to support the exploration process by defining arbitrary three-dimensional subspaces. Besides exploring arbitrary subspaces, we also present the first visualization techniques to represent multivariate Gaussians, and this consists of two parts. The first part is about various raycasting views, and the second part is about shape and basis comparison. These are the three raycasting views that are inspired by volume rendering techniques. The first technique is MIP, which stands for Maximum Intensity Projection. With this technique, we are able to identify the closest cluster in the domain. Second, we have the hull rendering, which gives us a better perception on the spatial arrangement of the Gaussian mixture model. And finally, DVR, which stands for direct volume rendering. This accumulates the weight through the Gaussian mixture model and visualizes the intensity. Besides new visualization techniques, we provide also shape and basis comparison. With this, we can compare the extents of individual Gaussians or explore several subspaces. On the left, for example, we see the circle and the line plot. These plots support the comparison of individual Gaussians and their extents. The small multiples sets every Gaussian in the focus and sets the subspace according to their largest three eigenvectors. The basis comparison shows individual combinations of eigenvectors of a certain Gaussian. When starting our framework and loading a Gaussian mixture model, it shows a smooth camera animation between the subspace of the largest three eigenvectors of the Gaussians. On the other hand, you can also have a look at the camera animation that shows the different eigenvector combinations. One major aspect of our work is that the visualizations are analytically determined on the GPU such that we achieve real-time performance. We do not have to deal with a ray tracing approach that samples the way where we have to hope that we hit the interesting regions. Everything is again analytically determined. In summary, we made the following contributions. We provide the first visualization system that supports user in the exploration of high-dimensional Gaussian mixture models containing many Gaussians. We are first to utilize 3D visualization techniques for which we derive closed-form analytic expressions to accelerate their rendering. We provide multiple helpful tools for exploration, including overview visualizations of shape and basis choices, basis customization, and smooth camera animations. And last but not least, we present an efficient GPU implementation that achieves real-time performance. If you are interested in a live demo and the source code of the shader, please visit our website and follow us on Twitter. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Kai should be with us. Kai, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Hi, so congratulations again on the honorable mention.
Thank you.
Are there questions? If you have a question, please raise your hand, or let me check the Slido. No questions in Slido. If there are no questions from the audience, let me go ahead and ask a question. So you mentioned in the paper that you, for the future, considering other dimensionality reduction schemes. Can you elaborate a little bit on what might be in store there?
Yeah, we also thought about to think more about the projection method that also takes the covariance metrics into account. So for now, if we calculate the eigenvalues and the eigenvalues, it might be interesting to project these eigenvectors such that they have, that they spread in the subspace such that we also span a space which is given by the covariance eigenvectors. So does it make sense?
Yeah, sure. All right. If there are no further questions, then in the interest of time, let's thank the speaker again. Thanks for being here. And let's move on to the next talk. So the next presentation is about quick clusters, a GPU parallel partitioning for efficient path tracing of unstructured volumetric grids. The presentation is given by Nate Morico, and again, this is an honorable mention for best paper. Congratulations, Nate.
Okay, So hello everyone, my name is Nate Moracle. I'm a graduate student from the University of Utah and a member of the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute. And today I'm excited to announce our method Quick Clusters, which you can use to render and explore large unstructured meshes like this in real time. With our method, we can do all of this without the long pre-processing times of prior methods. You can do this with a much lower technical complexity with prior methods, and then you can do all of this with just a single workstation GPU. But first, you might be wondering, what are unstructured meshes in the first place? And as our simulation capabilities improve, many big simulations are moving to more and more memory-efficient formats, which scale better to big data. And unstructured meshes are a very memory-efficient format because we can increase resolution in certain locations where it matters, and we can reduce the number of elements where we don't need them. And this ends up saving a lot of memory resources. We can go from petabytes of voxels to just a couple gigabytes of finite elements. So then you might wonder, can we visualize these data sets interactively then if they fit on our GPU architectures? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And that's because two challenges kind of stand in our way. So the first challenge is that we need an efficient way to perform point location queries on these unstructured meshes. And typically, we'll use something like an acceleration structure in order to make these point location queries fast and efficient. And our prior papers do this by leveraging ray tracing hardware in modern GPU architectures. So you can use these ray tracing cores to do this tree traversal for you, and then the surrounding graphics API can be used to construct these sorts of trees in parallel, so you don't really need to worry about that either. All you really have to think about when implementing these methods is to compute a set of element bounding boxes to put at the leaves of these trees, as well as implement these point and element tests to perform at these leaves during traversal. And we actually have supplemental material for you if you'd like to check that out and implement this yourself. The challenge with these trees is that although our data sets fit in GPU memory, the trees required to query these data sets do not. And then the second challenge is that if we're trying to use hardware-accelerated ray tracing, we can't access the internal nodes of these hardware-accelerated trees because different vendors implement different sorts of trees. The second challenge is that we have these huge data sets, and we have these super tiny features of interest that we want to look at. And so typically, to render these sorts of data sets, you'll hear people use ray marching, and ray marching takes equidistant distance samples into your volume from front to back, compositing results as you go. But when we have these super tiny features of interest, we have to increase our sampling rate dramatically in order to resolve these very small but intricate details. And that results in many samples taken in the surrounding regions, and that prevents interactive visualization. So how can we solve these two challenges while keeping our method simple and accessible to people? We discovered that you can solve most all of these challenges with a single data transformation, which is to reorder our elements along a Hilbert space-filling curve. So this Hilbert space-filling curve reorders elements in memory relative to their location in space, so that nearby elements in memory are nearby in space. And this allows us to very quickly cluster neighboring elements together in order to solve our two challenges. In terms of cluster quality, these Hilbert clusters aren't perfect, but they're fast and easy to compute. We can do this sort along a Hilbert space-filling curve using something like a parallel radix sort on a GPU. And then the clusters are medium quality, and that's good enough for us to solve the challenges that we're facing. So first, let's talk about the acceleration structure and memory consumption. So at the moment, we're building these hardware-accelerated trees down to the individual element. But that results in a lot of internal nodes near the leaves of these trees. And so what we can do is we can reorder our elements along a Hilbert space-filling curve, and then we can go and merge these elements near the leaves together. And what this does is this eliminates a significant number of these internal nodes near the leaves of our trees, and you find that most of your internal nodes are near those leaves because trees grow exponentially with depth. And in practice, what we do is we typically merge around 4 elements into the same leaf. And this works pretty well when we have elements reordered along a Hilbert curve because you know that they're nearby in space, so you can just merge neighboring elements in memory together when you go to build your tree. The second thing that we can do is we can recycle that previous reordered set of elements to also compress our unstructured mesh. So currently at the moment, our unstructured mesh is dominated by mesh indices, which are about 32 bits each. So what we can do is we can break up our mesh into these things that we're calling instance clusters. Each instance cluster contains around 30,000 to 60,000 elements each. And then we can ask the question, does this instance cluster use fewer than 2 to the 16 vertices? If an instance cluster uses fewer than 2 to the 16 vertices, then we can instead use 16 bits per index to address into those vertices. Finally, rather than building one big tree over on our unstructured mesh, we can instead build multiple treelets, these over each instance cluster. Each of these instance clusters, we're still using leaf clusters to compress the individual instance clusters, but then we instantiate them all into one top-level acceleration structure. And what this ends up doing is this brings down peak GPU memory consumption during these parallel tree builds, and then we can use the instance ID to determine how many bits per index we're using for an individual instance cluster. Finally, let's talk about rendering performance. So as I mentioned before, we have these really big unstructured meshes, but then these very small features of interest. And what we tend to do is we make these small features optically dense so that we can see them, while the surrounding elements are made very optically transparent so that they don't obstruct us, they don't obstruct our view. So typically, so ray marching kind of fails us here because ray marching takes these equidistant samples into your volume and it doesn't consider density. And what that ends up doing is you end up oversampling transparent regions and you undersample dense regions. So instead we use an algorithm called delta tracking, which is kind of commonly used in film. It's otherwise known as like path tracing for volume rendering. And with delta tracking, we can adapt the sampling rate relative to these things called local neighborhood majorants. And these majorants are just maximum density values associated in different parts of our volume. So once again, we can turn to our adaptive or we can turn to our Hilbert reordered elements and now cluster them into adaptive sampling clusters. Whenever we go to edit our transfer function, we can compute the maximum density value for these clusters. And then when we go to render our data, we can trace array through these adaptive sampling clusters, rasterizing them into these non-overlapping bins stored along our array that allow us to do adaptive sampling. And this can greatly improve our rendering performance. Alternatively, what you can do is you can take these adaptive sampling clusters, rasterize them into a regular grid of macro cells, and then employ an algorithm called DDA in order to traverse through those macro cells. And this allows your ray tracing cores to focus their efforts more on point location queries rather than adaptive sampling. So to evaluate our approach, we evaluated on 4 different data sets of differing sizes, starting with the TAC Japan earthquake data set, which is around 48 million hexahedra. Then we have the LANL impact data set, which is around 250 million elements. We have the NASA landing gear data set, which is around 300 million elements. And then finally, the NASA Mars lander data set, which comes in like a couple different sizes. This one's the smaller one, which is around 790 million mixed finite elements. And all of these contain a mix of tetrahedra, wedges, pyramids, and hexahedra. So in order, when looking at like our memory consumption, with this transformation that we can do, where you're able to see like a compression of up to like 3.2x for our bigger data sets. So we're going from around 30 gigabytes before to now a little less than 10. So that means that you can fit these data sets now on a card and query them and render them. And in order to do this compression, it takes only a couple seconds to do the sort. It takes only a couple seconds to cluster our data sets, and clustering is now independent of the number of elements per cluster because we're doing this more naive breaking up of our elements in memory. And then the expensive thing here is that we have to do this mesh reindexing whenever we compress like 32-bit indices into 16-bit indices. And that can take 1 to 4 minutes on our biggest data sets. In terms of, we also studied the effects of like pairing elements together at the leaves of our tree and how that reduces memory consumption and affects rendering performance. And we see like whenever you pair elements together or clusters together, that saves you about a 2x in terms of memory consumption. So we're going from 16 gigs down to 4, down to 2. And for every time that we do this, we see about a 5% to an 8% hit to rendering performance. But when you have interactive rendering, this is a worthy trade-off. This is sensitive, though, to how well your adaptive sampling does. So on some of our data sets, we struggle to adaptively sample the super tiny features, and then we're more sensitive to linear searches at the leaves. And so it's a bigger hit when you pair these like elements together. And then finally, we find that our Hilbert clusters are relatively robust to varying cell sizes. In terms of rendering performance, we see pretty dramatic performance improvements by moving from a ray marching approach to delta tracking, an adaptive delta tracking method. So for example, in our landing gear data set, or on our Mars lander data set, we struggled to hit 1 frame per second, and that's without shadows with a marching approach. But then when we move to delta tracking, we can amortize that sampling expense over time, and we go up to 16 frames per second. That's about a 30x improvement to rendering performance. And then one other thing that we found is that typically DDA is a faster method for adaptive sampling than a ray marching method, but it's not always, or than our ray tracing method. But that's not always true. There's some cases where tracing rays through adaptive sampling clusters is able to more like precisely model the majorant through your data set than macrocells do. So to summarize, to interactively visualize large unstructured meshes, we propose to sort your elements along a Hilbert space filling curve right before rendering. And then we use leaf clusters to reduce tree memory consumption and instance clusters to compress our unstructured mesh and to reduce peak tree memory consumption. Then finally, we use adaptive sampling clusters in combination with delta tracking during rendering to achieve interactive rendering performance. And all of these data transformations can be done before runtime, even for very large data sets. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you. We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand or post in Slido. No questions so far, so let me go ahead and ask a question. So you state in the paper that the pre-processing, the compression and the reindexing and everything still requires you to have the entire mesh in main memory. Do you see a way around that?
Right, so what we do right now is we put our entire unstructured mesh on the GPU before we build our trees, and then we can do this sort over like our elements on the GPU, but like that can be a problem if your entire unstructured mesh doesn't fit on maybe a consumer card. So I mean, an alternative for that is that you can sort your elements either on the CPU in parallel with something like TBB, where you typically have environments with more memory. I also think that it'd be possible to sort subsets of the data, like kind of tile the problem and sort subsets and then maybe merge the results into like one tree. It might require more than one level of instancing in an acceleration structure to do, but I think that should be possible. So.
All right. There are no further questions, and let's thank the author again. So the next presentation is about finding nano-ERTC, cryo-electron tomography visualization guided by learned segmentation. And the presentation is given by Cyril Bohak.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Cyril Bohak, and I'm a research scientist at KAUST. Today, I'm happy to present a work titled Finding Nano-ERTC, Cryo-Electron Tomography Visualization Guided by Learned Segmentations. This work is a collaboration with Ulm University, TU Vienna, Nanographics, and Tsinghua University. Okay. Since 2014, cryogenic electron microscopy has been the main method for reconstructing the molecular structures. So, but there are some challenges that we need to face, especially in the domain of microbiology, where we are limited with the amount of energy we can use for acquisition. Now, the main challenges are the amount of data, because there are so many electronic microscopes now out there. The researchers don't have time to actually process all the data in due time. And the other challenge is that in microbiological domain, the low signal-to-noise ratio is really problematic. You can see here in the top right picture that it's really hard to distinguish a specimen from the background. Okay, so until now, mostly researchers did annotations manually. So they actually had to go through this noisy data and label it manually, which is a very tedious and time-consuming work. So they tried to use different approaches to tackle this. One was, for instance, denoising or automatic segmentation, or to prepare an appropriate transfer function for visualization purposes. However, this does not result usually in good output. In our case, we take advantage of both. So the deep learning-based segmentation as a component for segmentation-aware transfer function design, which is then used for visualization of information hidden by the lower signal-to-noise ratio. We do not use any denoising or in the pre-processing step. Our visualization pipeline consists mainly of two steps, the segmentation step and the rendering step. In the segmentation step, we take the encoder-decoder network, which we trained on pseudo-labels, and pseudo-labels are those who are actually helping us to tackle the bottleneck issue. Then we automatically estimated transfer function parameters, which are then used for visualization. We showcase our use case on dataset of 60 volumes of SARS-CoV-2 virus, which was segmented into 4 classes. Now let's first check what are these pseudo-labels. So manual annotations is really tedious. So what we did here is we actually created a lot of sparse manual annotations and then propagate them within individual volumes. This was done using the Elastic software package. However, this proves not to work in between volumes. It worked very well within individual volumes, but it did not generalize. So what we did is we took those pseudo-labels and we used them for training our deep model. And it proved that that actually worked very nicely. So our deep neural network model is a 3D UNet with ResNet backend, and we used mean square error as a loss and adaptive, and we don't use any activation layers. We tried other combinations and other architectures as well, but this one proved good enough for our case. So here are some numbers how our segmentation compares to completely manual segmentation of the volume, to pseudo-labels, and how pseudo and completely manual annotations compare to each other with regard to the F1 score. What we managed to figure out is to see in the results that our segmentation model is actually quite better in some cases than the pseudo-labels that were used to train it. So you can see here that in the middle, some structures are actually better segmented than in pseudo-labels. And additionally, the areas are cleaner. The areas between the individual structures are cleaner in some cases. Okay, so our segmentation model was first trained for foreground-background segmentation and later retrained for 4-class segmentation. Here are the results of foreground-background segmentation and compared to traditional approaches that were used by researchers, which are thresholding technique or the denoising. This thresholding is YAN, a local thresholding technique that is available in Fiji software, and this denoising technique is topaz denoise for cryo-EM images. Okay, here you can see our final visualization results. So these blue structures are actually the inner part of the virus's lumen. The gray structures are membrane, and then the pink structures are spikes. Our final visualization runs in real time at full HD resolution for volumes that we used. So the volumes were 1,440 voxels by 1,024 voxels, and then it depends from 250 to 500 voxels. Okay, so about our visualization step, we automatically estimated the transfer function parameters. The transfer functions that we used in our visualization pipelines are simple ramp functions, where the right side of the ramp was always linked to value 1, but the left side was actually automatically estimated with a per class adaptive thresholding. Okay, so what we do in the next step is that every voxel from our segmentation mask is weighted with the original raw data to actually preserve the details from the original data. And then for better global illumination perception, we implemented local ambient occlusion, which gives us fine surface details, and soft shadows, which help us separate individual structures between each other. In the end, we additionally added bloom which increases the perceived dynamic range in the final rendering. Here is how our visualization compares to some of the direct volume rendering techniques which are commonly used in this domain. So isosurface rendering with 3 ISO levels, emission absorption model, maximum intensity projection, and volumetric path tracing. For emission absorption model and volumetric path tracing here, we manually selected the 2D transfer function, which was mostly separating the foreground from the background. So you can see that there is a lot of issues with the noise. Additionally, we compare our visualization with standard DVR techniques if they would have access to segmentation. So our technique is to the far left, and we can say that wanted output is volumetric path tracing, for instance, which is here to the far right, but this is not an interactive visualization technique. It took like 20 minutes to actually render such a virion in this case, while the other 4 are real-time techniques. You can see that our result actually mimics the output results, the desired output results the most. So, in conclusion, with this work, we demonstrate how we can harness the power of the deep neural networks to infuse visualization pipeline with detailed automatic segmentation, yielding high-quality visualization results. And this overtakes the cases where the regular volumetric rendering fails. So in our case, the inference of individual volumes, which are not small, takes approximately 20 to 25 seconds on a single NVIDIA V100 GPU. Our approach still has some limitation. Our network, segmentation network, needs to be retrained if the data that we want to visualize drastically differs from the data that it was trained on. But this training takes approximately 1 week, which is much, much, much less than it would be used to manually label even one volume. Okay? And the inference is fast, but it's not interactive, unfortunately. So our future work, in our future work, we have a goal to actually develop end-to-end visualization system, which will be deep learning supported and will take as an input cryo-EM projection images and will output the volume rendering image. So with this, thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to answer any of your questions.
All right, we have time for questions. Please raise your hand. But first, there's a question from Slido. How much does the segmentation quality depend on the repetitive nature of the raw data?
Thank you. That's a good question. Now, I don't really get what you mean here with the repetitive data. In our case, we used 60 volumes from a single laboratory, which were prepared with the same pipeline, but were not like completely the same. They differed a lot between each other, and it managed to train the segmentation really nicely. We did test also our model on data from different labs, but it proved that for foreground background segmentation, it is usable to some degree, but then you cannot use the 4-class segmentation if the specimen is different. So you need to retrain the last layer for the number of classes that you want to segment anyways.
So I would guess that the repetitive nature of the data that might address sort of the fact that you have sort of the same structures repeating over and over again.
Well, some of our volumes were actually very, very empty, while others were very populated like this one. Of course, it does matter how many virions, for instance, are there in individual volume, but we must also take into account that the quality of reconstruction in each tomogram differs from where each structure is in the tomogram. If the structures are closest to the axis of the reconstruction, then those structures are usually better segmented. But if they are more to the side of the reconstructed tomogram, there is less detail then. But still, our model managed to actually do quite good reconstruction.
All right, thank you. There are no further questions. Then let's thank the speaker again. And the next presentation will be about level set restricted Voronoi tessellation for large-scale spatial statistical analysis given by Tyson Neuroth virtually.
Welcome everybody. My name's Tyson, and I'll be talking about an approach to spatial statistical analysis of flow features and large-scale simulation data. This work was a collaboration with Jacqueline Chen's Combustion Science Group at Sandia National Laboratory. MK is now at the University of Alabama, and Aditya is at the India Institute of Science. The driving application of this work is the study of an ammonia, hydrogen, nitrogen fuel. This fuel has been proposed as a net zero carbon alternative to natural gas for large turbine engines such as those that drive container ships and power plants. The combustion team ran two simulations, one under 10 atm of pressure and another under 10 atms of pressure. And it was discovered that the high-pressure case leads to the emergence of small cellular structures that fragment the flame surface and cause instabilities. Here these structures are pointed out in a rendering of isosurfaces in the temperature field. The major obstacles that we contend with stem from the size, high dimensionality, and complexity of the phenomena. In terms of size, the volume data for a single time step is around 2 terabytes total, and around 90 gigabytes per field. This is too large to keep in memory for interactive visualization, and the full time series data is so large that even transferring it from one place to another is a highly time-consuming process. To deeply investigate the flow features of interest, the combustion scientists would like to co-analyze the evolution of surface structures in physical space with progress and events in the high-dimensional chemical space. First, we decompose the domain into isobands. In this example, the isobands are based on the temperature field. Next, we compute connected components of the isobands and then tessellate each component with the restricted Voronoi tessellation. Here we show a tessellation of one of the temperature isobands. After decomposing the data based on isobands, connected components, and Voronoi tessellations, lightweight summary data such as statistical moments and distribution functions can be computed for each of the segments. Since the decomposition has a nested hierarchical form, we sort the data and the data summaries so that a feature at any level will be contiguous on disk. This allows for efficient out-of-core extraction of features of interest and helps to support an interactive analysis workflow. We use a 2D combustion dataset to illustrate the Voronoi tessellation methodology. The methods generalize to 2D by setting the z dimensions to size 1. Given a scalar field, we decompose the domain based on isocontours. Note that an isoband is the area between consecutive pairs of contours. Next, we compute the connected components of the isobands using a union-find-based labeling algorithm. Now we need to generate an initial distribution of Voronoi sites to cover the connected components. But first, we further decompose the components into blocks for spatial stratification to prevent the initial site placement from bunching up. Next, we determine the number of Voronoi sites to place in each segment. This is based on the area or volume of the segment and the target site density parameter, or in the weighted centroidal Voronoi tessellation case, which we'll cover shortly, also based on a function of voxel mass or saliency and an attraction bias parameter. Then we generate a random distribution of initial sites. The random sample will cover each connected component of each isoband with at least one site. Next, we classify the voxels to their nearest sites based on the lengths of the restricted paths between the voxels and the Voronoi sites. As an example, in the displayed image, a non-line of sight voxel is mapped to its Voronoi site through the path shown as a red dotted line. We then move the Voronoi sites to new, more centroidal positions within their regions, and repeat the process a number of times to get the final result. In our case, since our regions may not be convex, we take an alternative approach to the centroidal updating stage. Don't worry about the math, we'll cover it shortly. The repetition of these stages is known as Lloyd's algorithm, which is a popular algorithm for computing a centroidal Voronoi tessellation. Now we will give a brief overview of the changes that we've made to make these steps more suitable for our case. In the illustration in the upper right, the bright green areas represent the isoband between isovalues A and B. In the upper left, one connected component of the isoband is shown, and the component is tessellated by 3 Voronoi regions. S denotes a Voronoi site, and R sub S is the Voronoi region, which contains all the voxels that have been classified to site S. That region is shown in the lower right. In the normal case, the centroid would be computed as an average or weighted average of the vectors between the site position and the positions of the voxels. However, the centroid in a non-convex region isn't guaranteed to be within the region or within the boundaries defined by the isocontour-based restrictions. In the lower left, our approach is illustrated. Each voxel has a pathway to the site point respecting the restrictions. When averaging the vectors, we only consider the position vectors of the voxels that are within the line of sight of the Voronoi site. The non-line of sight voxels, shown in black, instead propagate their weights to the nearest line of sight voxel along their paths, denoted phi of v. This helps to allow voxels around corners to influence the direction of the site update without pulling it directly towards the boundaries that separate them. The site is then moved along the direction of the weighted average and stopped if it runs into a restriction. As mentioned, we also vary the site concentration based on an underlying saliency function. Here we show both a 2D and a 3D example. For scalability, we use a data-distributed parallel algorithm based on a block decomposition with MPI. Within each block, the tessellation is computed on the GPU using thrust and CUDA. While this isn't a globally optimal solution, it has the advantage that whole blocks can be loaded or transferred without clipping Voronoi cells. The GPU parallelism is based on a region growing approach, which is parallelized over voxels, and more details can be found in the paper. Next, I'll briefly present our prototype visualization system based on these methods. First, we need a method to make selections through the hierarchically organized data. We represent each connected component and also each Voronoi region by a 2D point and a TSNE plot. The TSNE points are laid out based on statistical attributes associated with the segments and can incorporate multivariate information. The user follows a hierarchical drill-down workflow by first selecting connected components using a lasso tool and then selecting Voronoi sites from within those connected components. A linked tree view can also be used to make these selections. The associated voxel data is then aggregated into statistical plots. We designed a flexible and interactive 2D joint plot based on the input from our combustion science team. More details about these tools can be found in the paper. Now I'll just show a short clip of the visualization system. First, we select a subset of connected components, and we make a subselection of Voronoi sites from within those selected components. The joint plots support scatter plots, CDFs, and different models for PDFs, including histograms, Gaussian mixture models, and kernel density estimation. The views can be panned and zoomed, and indicators on the marginal distributions show the current zoom and pan level. The system switches to histograms for interactive modeling when zooming, since it can be recomputed quickly. If voxel data is available, linked subselections can be made further directly in the plots. Selections can also be refined using subset operators with the lasso tool. Bounding surfaces of the subselections are then computed and visualized in the 3D view. We'd like to thank Chi Wu at UC Davis for stimulating discussions, and we'd like to thank the Department of Energy for funding this work, and the computing facilities which provided computational resources to carry it out. And thank you for your attendance.
All right. Hello, Tyson, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, we can hear you. So there's time for questions. Please raise your hand or post in the Slido. No questions yet, so let me go ahead and ask a question. So looking at the performance figures in your paper, you mentioned that this is possibly an in situ method. So do you have a means of getting the performance to a point where this would be applicable in situ?
Yeah, I think the problem with testing it in situ is the simulation is very large and they can't just rerun it without using a lot of resources. But so we just tested it on the checkpoint data. So I don't really have a good analysis right now of like what the cost would be relative to the simulation performance or the simulation computation time. One other issue, I guess, is once we use it in situ, we have to think about how the data is distributed. So I think the real simulation uses a much many more nodes than we used in our test. So in that case, the blocks might be smaller. In which case you may want to redistribute the data, depending on if you want to change the block size for your decomposition.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? That is not the case. Then let's thank Tyson again.
Thank you.
And this gets us to the last presentation of this session about watertight incremental height field tessellation. The presentation is given by Daniel Cornell.
All right. Do you hear me? Yeah. Great. So thank you. I'm Daniel Cornell, and together with my colleagues, I've been working on a method for watertight incremental height field tessellation. Height field tessellation is the process of creating a triangular surface that approximates a given height field. This is a well-researched topic, especially its application for terrain rendering. But the efficient tessellation of dynamic height fields, like the output of a flood simulation, remains very challenging. Since the simulation data are generated on the fly, tessellation also has to happen on the fly. So we cannot rely on pre-computed acceleration data structures as used in many terrain rendering systems like ROAM, raster, or geometry clip maps. The goal of tessellation is that the created triangles have roughly the same size in screen space, like in this example here. On the left, we visualize the triangles of the terrain height field in green and the water height field in blue, where a change in color indicates a change in triangle size. As you can see in this zoom animation, the triangle sizes are adapted continuously to achieve the desired screen space size. This task is typically performed with the help of the hardware tessellation unit in modern GPUs, which is very efficient at subdividing triangles. However, when I show you 2 consecutive frames of this zoom animation, you will notice that almost none of the triangles change their level of detail from one frame to the next. Only a handful of triangles have to be changed, and the rest could be reused from the last frame. But this also means reverting a subdivision when triangles are too small already. And this is something that hardware tessellation cannot do. It can only subdivide triangles but not merge them together again, which is why you have to create the entire triangulation from scratch every frame. Instead, we want to cache the entire triangulation and only incrementally update it where needed, which is significantly faster than hardware tessellation. So how do we do this? We start with a height field defined on a rectangular area and create a very coarse and regular initial triangulation that covers this area. This triangulation is made up of 4 different types of right triangles, illustrated here by different colors. We now define subdivision rules to split these triangles into smaller versions of themselves for subdivision. A popular splitting scheme is the longest edge bisection, which splits a right triangle along the bisector of its hypotenuse. With this scheme, we can split an original triangle into 2 smaller ones of types we haven't seen before. So for these 4 types, we also need to define subdivision rules. Luckily, the longest edge bisection splits each of these triangles into a pair of triangles of the first 4 types, which means we can apply these rules recursively. That sounds very easy, so let's see how well it works. In this example, we have only 2 triangles that we can split into 4 smaller ones. Now we can split the blue triangle on the left, and then, for example, the purple one to the bottom left. But now we run into a problem because we have created a T-junction, meaning we have split one triangle without also splitting the neighboring triangle along its hypotenuse. Let's look at this in 3D. The split introduces a new vertex on the shared edge, which is then sampled on the height field and shifted along the height dimension. Now the triangulation has a hole and is no longer watertight. This reveals the background of the scene, which is noticeable as pixel flickering in a visualization. To guarantee watertightness, we need to improve our subdivision rules. If we want to subdivide this blue triangle, we cannot just subdivide this triangle independent of its neighbors. This is why for each cached triangle, we store explicit triangle adjacency information. This information allows us to find the neighboring triangle that shares the hypotenuse of the triangle we want to subdivide. Only if the shared edge is the hypotenuse of both triangles, we can split both of them simultaneously. If we want to split this triangle afterwards, we can look for the neighbor along the hypotenuse with the triangle adjacency information, and we'll find out that the shared edge is not the neighboring triangle's hypotenuse. No subdivision can happen here unless the triangle on the left is subdivided first. From this neighbor check, we can formulate another subdivision rule. Given our 8 triangle types and all the different arrangements they can have, there are only these 4 valid combinations where the shared edge is the hypotenuse of both triangles. So for subdivision, we only have to find and replace these 4 valid combinations with 4 smaller triangles. The other way around, for merging, we remove the 4 small triangles and reinstate the 2 parents. This guarantees that T-junctions can never happen during subdivision. The challenge that remains is how to apply these rules concurrently. If we want to split these colored triangles in a GPU implementation, we want to perform subdivision concurrently for maximum efficiency. So we perform each subdivision in its own thread. In both threads, we split the triangles and then update the adjacency information of the neighboring triangles to refer to the newly created ones. And you already see what will happen. In each thread, there exists a triangle that no longer exists because it has been subdivided in the other thread. Without synchronization, it is not possible to guarantee that the triangle references in the cached adjacency information remain valid. Low-level synchronization of the read and write accesses to this information are possible, but that is a complex task. Instead, we propose a higher-level synchronization with the help of our triangle colors, and we adopt the concept of task scheduling by graph coloring. In terms of graph coloring, any recursive application of our subdivision rules results in a valid 8 coloring of the plane. If you look at this colorful triangulation, you can see that no triangles of the same color share an edge. This means that all triangles of the same color can be processed concurrently without any issues. Only between the different colors synchronization is necessary. And even though we have 8 different triangle colors, we only have 4 valid combinations of colors. So we only need 4 separate processing passes for subdivision and merging with explicit synchronization in between. Let's put it all together. We start with a coarse initial triangulation that covers the entire height field area. After that, or whenever the height field data change, we resample the cached vertices at the height field. After that, or whenever the camera changes, we evaluate the level of detail of each triangle and decide whether to keep it, subdivide, or merge it. With this information, we loop over all cached triangles in 4 separate passes for the 4 triangle colors with synchronization between them and apply 1 level of subdivision to all necessary triangles. We then loop over the triangles again in 4 separate passes and merge triangles as needed. We now have a complete triangulation that we could render, but we only performed 1 iteration of subdivision and merging, so locally the desired level of detail might not be reached yet. If further changes are needed, we repeat the process and loop over these steps again until no further changes are required. If we reach that point, or if a termination criterion is reached, such as a processing time budget for the frame is used up, we render the cached triangles. So this is the general workflow of our technique, but in the paper we also describe additional important performance optimizations. We compare the performance of our method to previous work, including a hardware tessellation approach shown in orange, and 2 cached tessellation approaches in blue and green that do not produce watertight triangulations. Our method, shown in red, has a very stable runtime performance that outperforms the other methods, especially when using higher order interpolation during vertex sampling. Additionally, the triangulations of our method exhibit the smallest error in approximating the height field surface. It is therefore faster and more accurate than the current state of the art, while at the same time guaranteeing a watertight triangulation without visual artifacts. And finally, I want to highlight that the animation you see here is taken from our reference implementation, for which you can find the source code in the supplemental material of our paper. And now I thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time for questions. Here's a question, Lars.
Lars Linsen, University of Münster. Thank you very much for a nice talk. So we had this Test of Time award this year for Marc Duchesneau on the roaming approach. The idea he has these 4/8 measures, and they look very similar to the connectivity you get over here. Are there differences? Is it the same? How do they compare?
That's a very good question. So the difference is how you apply it, because the roam, for example, it pre-computes basically the entire triangulation offline, in an offline process, because the terrain data are static. And so we actually calculate this triangle binary tree on the fly. In each, or we incrementally update this binary tree on the fly in each frame, because we cannot pre-compute it. But the internal structure that we use is in the end also a binary tree, so it's quite similar, just without a pre-processing.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just a very quick follow-up, because I had a very similar question. So assuming you could pre-compute the triangulation, would that afford you more quality, or how would that be better in any way?
Actually, the pre-computation takes away a feature, because we have subdivisions of each triangle, but if you pre-compute it, you have to specify some finite number of subdivisions that you want to reach. So it is certainly faster if you can pre-compute it, because you at runtime you just have to select which triangles you want to render, and you don't have to split them first. But yeah, you lose flexibility at the benefit of a higher frame rate.
All right. If there are no further questions, then let's thank all the speakers again. And we are done right on time, and enjoy your coffee break.